I heard a rumor last week after the hymn sing that y'all sounded really, really good. And you do sound really, really good. You can sing. It's okay too if you sing along the parts like I do, because that was pitched today where I couldn't sing it, but I could sing the bass part. And I can even sing the old bass part that moved around a lot. So that was, I appreciate that. It's nice to do that. It's nice to have a diversity of music because we sound different ways in here. None of us grew up with the same music, believe it or not. When I was preaching up at New Light in Hagerstown, I thought I was blessed because I had a Southern Baptist piano player who had grown up on the same hymnal I had. But would you know that he didn't know some of the songs that I knew? And I didn't know some of the songs that he did. One hymnal, but he came up with a whole different group of music than I did. You know, that's just the way that music is. People have different tastes. I would guess if I took a survey, all of you don't listen to the same thing on the radio, right? And then the other thing is that there were people who weren't here last week, and I honestly had a couple of them tell me that they don't relate to hymns at all. So they don't come to hymn sing Sunday because they know that hymns, they just don't, you know, that's not meaningful to them. And that's okay, we'll still do hymn sings, and we'll still do music that relates to those who like hymns. But please don't ever assume that everybody likes the same things you do, because I don't like to see you being wrong. And sometimes you're just going to be wrong if you believe that about that kind of thing, because it's different for different people. We each like different stuff. I'm one of those weirdos that likes blended, that likes a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of the other. There are very few of us, and we're not very popular people. But that's just where I come from. I like a little bit of everything. So I'm thrilled to see that we have good voices. I'm thrilled to see that God seems to be sending us a lot of musicians recently. And that those musicians tend to come from the Southern Gospel vein. Because I didn't grow up on Southern Gospel, but I sure do like it. And they know it. And so I'm looking forward to hearing more of that in our worship as well. Because I think there are people out there that have been kicked out is a nice word from their churches. Probably prayed over and pushed down the aisle, would be more like it, or prayed over for deliverance or whatever, who come out of those Southern gospel traditions. And they need a church that sounds for them like the church they came out of. And so I hope that we can do a little bit of that too, and that we'll all be patient with each other as we learn to be the MCC church that God has called us to be. We pray with you, please. God, I thank you for this opportunity to be church, for this opportunity to manifest something that nobody's ever seen before, to be a people of God that proclaims your love for all people. And when we say that, we mean all people. Now, all people aren't going to be comfortable here, God, but we know that we can proclaim an inclusive love, a love that includes who we love, a love that includes how we live, and a love that proclaims your love for the world. Help us to always proclaim your love for the world. Amen.
Amen.
In this season, it was August, but it's September now, and I'm still preaching it. I'm talking about what it means to change or transition or move into a new place. And I can think of no better story in the Hebrew Scriptures anyway than the story of the Exodus. The story of God's people after 320 years of captivity. Some of it, probably the first few hundred years, were not too bad, but they got worse and they got worse, and eventually they started being counted just so that the Egyptians could tell how many of them there were to continue to suppress and hold back and to build pyramids and to do awful things. And they were being held in captivity, but they were used to that captivity. You know, after 320 years, you kind of get accustomed to things. You kind of think about that being, that's just the way it is. That's what we're going to have to live with. That's what it's going to look like. But all of a sudden, God tapped this man named Moses, who already had come out, who already was born a Hebrew child, but was raised in the courts of the Pharaoh. And God said, it's your turn to take people out of captivity. And can't you imagine that Moses said, why me? Why would I ever do that? Why would that happen to me? Why would you give me such a ridiculous calling? And then to help Moses understand that calling, you know, sometimes God has to push us out of the nest first before we can do what God's called us to do. God has to make the place where we were so uncomfortable that we just can't stay there anymore. I don't always think God's pushing a button up in heaven saying, I'm going to make you uncomfortable. But I had been in a situation, a couple of them in my life, that it just became so uncomfortable that I had to move on. And later on, I could look back and with perspective say, I needed to move on. If I hadn't moved from that, I wouldn't be where I am now. And so what God did to Moses is Moses saw a Hebrew man being abused by an Egyptian, and he killed the Egyptian. Just right out murdered him. So, when you hear all this thing about these wonderful people in the Bible, know that some of them were murderers, and some of them were adulterers, and some of them did all kinds of horrible things on the way to becoming the people that God had called them to be. Moses murdered somebody. And he knew that the law was after him. He knew that what he had done would eventually catch up with him. So he knew that even though he felt safe where he was, he couldn't stay safe. He knew he was called to bring not only himself, but the people of God out of captivity. And so then he went back into the courts of Pharaoh and began to talk to them about these plagues that God was going to send. And you can imagine that didn't make him very popular in the courts of Pharaoh, especially the one we talked about 2 months ago about the frogs. Waking up with the frogs every morning and having the frogs climbing up over the bed sheets. Well, after that was locusts. After that, or before that, was blood in the rivers. All kinds of nasty things were happening because the Pharaoh wouldn't let God's people go. The Pharaoh would say, okay, I've changed my mind, you can go. And then the next morning would say, no, wait a minute, stay. So all of that happened, and the Exodus didn't finally begin until something died. And we talked about the necessity sometimes that something has to die. Something has to end. Some things in our past we have to let go of completely in order to move forward. In this case, first of all, it was the firstborn. Not just of the Egyptians, but all of their cattle and all of their slaves. All of the firstborn that were not marked by the blood of the Lamb, that didn't have blood on their doorposts. And it doesn't say it specifically, but I think it probably would relate to even some of the Hebrew children that didn't think that God was serious. Because everywhere else we can read in Exodus that the people of God didn't always think God was serious. But that all of those firstborn babies had to die. Now, being a firstborn baby, I don't like that. I don't know. We often it's said that we have this great birthright, but I can't see it. David wasn't firstborn. Firstborn doesn't always get these dibs that they seem to be talking about. But in this case, anyway, the firstborn had to die. Pharaoh said, go ahead and go. I've got to let you go. They get out of Egypt, and they're out in the desert traveling toward the river. They're trapped at the edge of the river, and then Pharaoh changes his mind and said, go get them. Let's go get them. Let's take all of our horses and chariots, all the might of my army, and let's go chase them. Well, they got to the river, and Moses parted the river, took the people through the river. The Egyptians got out into the middle of the river. Their chariots started bogging down in the mud, and when that happened, they drowned. So not only did the firstborn drown, but all of the best chariots, all the best horses, all the best soldiers drowned. When we're going to have a change, when change is coming, it's inescapable. Something has to die. Some dream, some possibility, some way that we looked at the world has to be let go of. We have to say, that is not going to be in order for this to happen. I'm probably never going to pastor. Well, I think I'm old enough now I can say I'm never going to pastor a church of 2,000 Baptists. That's not going to happen. That's not in my future. That's what my father thought would happen for me. Because I was handsome when I was the eloquent one in the family. I was the firstborn. I was the one he expected that of. But I had one little quirk that he wasn't aware of at the time that he thought that. So my next brother is the one who became the pastor. But he's content being a youth pastor. He's content still, and I don't either now, but not wearing socks. Running around barefooted a lot of the time. First Baptist churches don't often have pastors who do that. That's just not what a First Baptist church pastor is supposed to do. And his two girls, well, they're typical PKs, and they're not quite living up, to the reputation that a First Baptist pastor's daughter should either. Now, I happen to be in Sunday school with the First Baptist pastor's wife from the church where my brother is, and she was even then being groomed to be a First Baptist pastor's wife. People kind of assigned us to each other. How that happens in Sunday schools. They say, well, David really should be dating Tish, And David says, I don't think so. I don't know who I am yet, but I know I'm not going to be marrying Tish. She's a great girl, good friend, very good friend, but that's about all she's ever going to be. But God made it possible for me to pastor this church in this day. And I know that was God's plan A for me. But I had to let go of those other plans. I used to even have a dream in my 20s that I was going to be pastor of First Baptist in Charleston. It happened more than once. And I thought, well, what's that about? I just kind of laughed at it. Well, I'm in Charleston, not at First Baptist, but I'm at First MCC. And I believe that God didn't put me here by accident. So something has to die. Second of all, we talked about our old tastes, the way we like for things to be, the way that we've grown up with things being. I found the other passage last night in Numbers that talks about not just the spices and the flesh pots of Egypt that they longed for, but they even longed for the cucumbers and the melons of Egypt. After a while, they said, we are sick of this manna day after day after day. It looks something like cornflakes. Can't we get some cucumbers? Can't we have some melons, even some fish that we were used to? Why can't we have the kind of food we used to have in Egypt? Complain, complain, complain. They were not happy with that. And that's when, and I knew that story was in there somewhere, it's just the Exodus stories get retold in Numbers when it's counting off the people. But they also asked for quail, and God gave them quail. God started giving them quail on a regular basis. But even again, they said, well, quail's great, but I sure would like some lamb. A friend of mine who was homeless at the time used to say, when you're serving the homeless, you have to be prepared that when you offer a cup of rice, they're going to come back and say, can I have some butter with this? That there's always something more, something more. When Jesus said the poor will always be with you, we quote that out of context. But we also know that the needs will always be there. Now Jesus said, but I'm not going to be with you always. Sometimes we have to take care of the greater need in order to meet the broader need. But there is that need for more. And people were dissatisfied. People were dissatisfied all through the journey. And last week we talked about people becoming impatient and how their impatience cost them even more time. How their impatience for Moses and for his brother meant that when he got so impatient, he banged on the rock twice instead of simply touching the water as he was directed to do. God said, well, you're just as impatient as the rest of them. So you're not personally going to make it into the promised land. Of all the people that left Egypt, only 2 of them, and perhaps, depending on how you read it, some of their family members, ever got to actually physically walk into the promised land. The rest of them got left in the desert on the way. They were part of the journey. People could look back and say, well, Aunt Bertha got us here. But Aunt Bertha didn't get to make the journey over. Didn't get to make that final step of the journey. And a big piece of that was the impatience. The unwillingness to accept that God's time is seldom, if ever, our time. And so that's what we've talked about for the last few weeks, and that brings us up to this story, which honestly, maybe because I'm a church organizer type person, it's one of my favorite stories in the Bible. First of all, it's a story about a father-in-law giving advice. How many of you got along well with your in-laws? Boy, no hands. So a couple maybe. My father-in-law refused to even shake my hand after he figured out who I am. First time I met him, he gave me a neck rub, which kind of freaked me out. Because he was standing behind me, I didn't know what was happening. But the second time I met him, he had figured out who I was to his baby boy. And so he refused to even shake my hand or acknowledge that I was in the room. And that's what happened in person. What was said outside the room doesn't bear repeating in the church anyway. In-laws often are not people that we want to listen to. But Moses was blessed in having a relationship with this father-in-law that started because the father-in-law had observed his character. At the point that Moses ran into his wife, and it's unclear in scriptures whether Moses had one or two or even more wives. One of them we know in Numbers is referred to as the Cushite, which means that she was an African, and when she's depicted as she's a person of color, and his brother and his sister objected to her because she was a person of color, and he should have married a good Jewish girl and not a Cushite, but she turned out to be a hero. The wife that is referred to here, Jethro's daughter, probably not the same daughter. Her name is Zipporah. But she's out watering her father's cattle, and the men who are gathering around, the Egyptians, are being so cruel and keeping her from getting to the well that Moses comes and scares them off so that the cattle can be watered, and then goes home. And when the girls get home, they say that the father says, Jethro says to them, well, why did you get home so early? Why are you here already? And they said, well, because we met this man and he helped water our cattle for us. That wasn't men's work, that was women's work. He helped water our cattle, and then we got home early. And knowing that, Jethro said, well, you need to bring him to dinner. Ever met somebody, I know some of your parents, you met somebody, you need to bring that one home. That one sounds like a keeper. I want to know more about them. That's what Jethro had done when he found out about Zipporah's mate. Now, Jethro, we read, was a priest. And he was a priest of a different religion, and not a lot is known about that religion. But he was a priest in a different religion, but he was known as a wise man. And at the point that he and Moses developed a relationship, he says, your God is greater than my God, and so I will bring an offering to your God. And so this bond is formed, and they honor each other, but they honor God even greater, and they build that bond that they have in God. So that's how Jethro and Moses become trusted friends. That was my ding, and I'm not sure why it's doing that, but it's probably Facebook. Anyway. Then Jethro is there in the courts and is observing Moses sitting around, surrounded by people from morning till evening. And why? Because Moses said, people come to me to inquire of God. Verse 15. Because people come to me and inquire when they have a dispute, they come to me. And I decide between one person and another. And I make known to them the statutes and the instructions of God. And Moses' father-in-law says to him, and these are words that we should feel free to say to others and others should say to us, what you are doing is not good. What you are doing is not good. You will surely wear yourself out. You are surely taking a role upon yourself that's not your role. You're surely being the one that has to do it all, to be it all, to understand it all in order for it to happen. And you're going to wear yourself out, and you're also going to wear your people out. And nobody's going to walk away from this happy. That happens so many times in the church. I'm not saying this to be a pity party for me. Please hear me on this. Although it is a little bit. I came out of a Baptist tradition. Baptist pastors usually don't teach Sunday school. We teach teachers. We come up with curriculum for other people to teach. When I went to Methodist Seminary, it was as if the class could never be offered unless it was taught by the pastor. Well, you can imagine how restrictive that is. If the pastor is the only one who teaches, then you can only have as many classes as the pastor can teach. And I'd like to say you're also getting classes that are biased by what the pastor thinks. You're not finding out the full breadth of what God has said to a group of people. The best teacher that I ever had as a youth was a mechanic. Probably said that to you before. He was a garage mechanic. He took apart engines. And I used to think that he took apart verses the same way that he would take apart an engine. And you could see how it worked, and you could see what all the pieces were, and you could see how the verb bounced off the adjective, bounced off of a verse 2 verses away. So when I got to seminary, my teacher was amazed at this Baptist boy that knew how to deal with the verse. But I could look at it as a structure and see the structure just like you could see an engine. And I was able to take it apart that way. That's the way that he taught us. My sister had the same teacher. And he just was a great teacher. My mom taught second grade Sunday school from the time that she was 20-something till the time that she was 80-something. And was still sweet as she could be, but she couldn't remember their names anymore. and sometimes couldn't remember which room she needed to go to. But she could still love on them and teach them, and she still knew the lessons because she had always taught those same lessons. If she was honest, she taught children's Sunday school because she got bored in adult Sunday school. She had probably an advanced condition of ADHD, and sermons just bored her to death. I don't think I ever saw her not fall asleep during a sermon. So if you sleep during the sermon, I just think of my mother. It doesn't hurt my feelings. But she taught the children, and she liked second graders because they knew how to read. First graders bored her because they didn't know how to read yet. She wanted kids that were smart enough to know how to read, and then she could work with them. So she seemed real sweet and lovely, but she had a very specific track that she wanted to be on. When my brother and my sister were youth, she worked with the youth for a while, and I think she just needed to keep an eye on them. But as soon as they had grown up, she went back to the second graders. That was her preference. That's how a Baptist church functioned. You had other people that would do the teaching. And the church that my parents were in at the point that they died was a committee church, in that it had committees that did everything in the church, and there were women on all the committees. Eventually, there were women on all of the boards, even the board of deacons. And there was a big debate about whether women should be allowed to be deacons. And my mother was opposed to women being deacons. And I asked her why, or actually my feminist sister asked her why at one point. She said, because it's the last thing in the church that men have to do. And if women become deacons, then men won't do anything. It was the most amazing reverse feminist argument I've ever heard. But it's what my mother believed. Because everything else was shared. And she wanted men to have to at least do that one, or they would give that over to the women too and let the women learn. But it was a committee church, and all the work of the church was done by a group of people, not by the pastor. In MCC, in our own polity, we talk about the pastor handling the spiritual nurture and the spiritual well-being of the church. We get a little confused when we also put the pastor on the board of directors and have him moderate the board of directors. But we understand that something that we call the priesthood of all believers, that everybody in the church brings their own gifts, their own abilities, and their own callings, and you may be much more, or not maybe, you are much more gifted at some of the things that this church does than I do. You just need to accept that gift. Two things have happened recently that worry me. Every time I go on vacation, nobody, except David, and David doesn't want to do it, but David apparently is qualified, according to some people here, to serve communion. Or me. Nobody else is. That's not MCC polity, folks. In MCC, you could consecrate the communion right where you're sitting, whoever you are. You don't have to have a priest collar. When MCC DC started MCC Rehoboth at the beach, we used to be called MCC by the Sea, we had this myth that you had to be a deacon to go celebrate communion over there, so they didn't have communion every week. And that was so that the deacons could always have a place to stay for free at the beach, honestly. Well, I can go to the beach this weekend because they need me to serve communion. No, we don't need me to serve communion. Anybody can serve communion. We are going to have a couple of weeks where you have to consecrate yourself. So it's either going to be consecrate yourself or go home without communion. Because we need to understand and respect what the priesthood of all believers means. We need to understand that what we are doing in some cases is not good. That God calls all of us to use our gifts. Now, are all of you called to preach? Absolutely not. Are all of you called to serve on the altar? Absolutely not. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is that God has distributed gifts, and until we discover that, we are not the body of Christ. We are a group of people that gather together to hear one leader talk about who Christ is. And my perspective is as narrow as I am. And I'd like to hear what you think. I'd like to hear what the whole church has to say. I know that what I am doing is not always good. Now let's take it a little bit beyond the church. Is what you're doing in your personal life good? Or are you taking care of everything? Do you have a family that you are the Savior in? And are you the only one in your family that can take care of certain things? When mom gets sick, are you the one they always call? When sister gets sick, are you the responsible one? When sister can't balance the checkbook, are you the one they always think about? Are you the one who always has to take care of that? What you are doing is not good. At some point, sister's got to learn to balance her checkbook. At some point, brother is going to have to start doing the things that brother is responsible for, especially if he's got kids. You know, it's funny, a lot of times in our churches, we're the ones, not always, but we can be the ones who didn't have children. And yet we end up being assigned the responsibility to take care of everybody else's children, don't we? All the ones that went out there and had children that can't take care of them, that becomes our responsibility. Sometimes because they'll say, well, you don't have children, so you should have the time to do this. I don't have children because I didn't want to have children. Not because I wanted to raise somebody else's. I didn't have children because I did not want to raise children. Because I knew that was more responsibility than I wanted. And it's not that I won't. It's just that what I'm doing is not good if I tell somebody else, you don't have to take care of your kids. Do you have one of those relationships where you have to take care of everything? They happen, don't they? In fact, we tend to find partners that are just like that. That, you know, if we're really good and codependent and we're able to do everything, we find a partner that needs us to do all that. That's the only kind of partner we'd be comfortable with, is one that is needy. At some point, what you are doing is not good. You're not helping them, and you're certainly not helping yourself. It's time to put on your big boy and big girl pants and tell them to do the same. And to say what you're doing is not good, distribute the joy of what it means to be human beings living in God. There's a structure that comes here. I pulled out, for those of you who get bored with my sermons, you're not alone, but on Sundays we have two little Sunday school lessons back there, one for the 3 to 6-year-olds and one for the 7 to 12-year-olds. And it's a little book that has like several little exercises, a word game, and a trace the different people and all that. So if you're bored with mine, I always make more than you need, so pick up one of those and you can play with those. Just be sure that all the kids here have one. But I especially like the one this morning because in the 3 to 6-year-old version, there's one of these, you know, the Find Waldo type things, and it says Find Moses is the project. But in the one for the 7 to 12-year-olds, it has the same picture, find Moses. Moses still looks alike. But then it says, find the other 5 people in the crowd. And that makes it a little harder. One of the hard things in the church is finding the other 5 people in the crowd. The ones that are responsible. The ones that will take things seriously. The ones who are generous in their giving. The ones that you can trust with the treasury. The ones that you can know are going to make things happen. Those are hard to find. And from my perspective, from one person's perspective, we're not always the ones that can help find them. But you can. But we're never going to find them if they don't get a chance to prove themselves. And one thing that we do sometimes is we say, well, we don't know them, so we can't trust them automatically. Or we know them and we're never going to trust them again. Both of those are mistakes. Because people change. I believe in a God. How many of you believe in a God who changes people? I hope almost everybody. Now, there are patterns that are established, yes. But I believe in a God who changes people. And in doing that, I hope that I can give somebody a second chance in order to do something. Now, you know, fool me once, shame on me. Whatever that one is. Fool me twice, shame on me. So yeah, at some point I have to say, no, we're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to give you that much responsibility. My first project in an MCC was to organize a banquet. And it was a good thing to give me because I organized banquets for an association. Then after that, shortly after that, I was put on the board of directors, and shortly after that, I became the vice moderator of the board of directors, even though I was the youngest male on the board. And at that time, you had to be male to be the vice moderator. It was a shame, but that's where that church was. That's not true, actually. There had been a female. But anyway, it was generally a male. You needed to be a male to be the vice moderator. That's sad. But anyway, let's give people a chance. If we're going to find these other 5 leaders and identify them and trust them and give them an opportunity, it's going to have to be a group project. identifying the people here that are capable of that. Now, let me give you a warning on that. That doesn't mean when they walk through the door and you sense a warm body nearby, you immediately say, you are in charge of this. Go in peace. That doesn't help. That's not how you build the kingdom. But finding those 5 people, being selective about who you choose, and this is unfortunate that it was men then, because I don't believe it's that anymore. But the call is to find people who are better at what you're doing than you are, or can be. And the only way you're going to know if they're better at what they're doing is if you give them a chance. I ask you to give people a chance. I ask you to be willing to look at yourself and say the hard words and hear the hard words. What you were doing is not good. And trust that God has a better way. Pray with me, please. Holy God, I thank you for your word. I thank you for the advice of our elders, for Jethro, who brought this wise word, who trusted his son-in-law to take it and to do something with it, and for Moses, his son-in-law, who did. In Jesus' name.